Welcome to the first webinar on science policy organized by Science Europe, and moreover, science policy event organized with and for researchers. I am very happy that we have organized this session with a fantastic panel of experienced scientists and research experts that will hopefully guide all of us and explain the intricacies of being at the frontier of science and policymaking, what sort of advice we can provide as scientists, and what's the best way to provide it so that it lands rightly on the tables of the policymakers. Science Europe is developing a whole series of activities regarding the use of the research results in several domains, the use of research results in policymaking, in education, in communication. And this activity, therefore, is framed by our strategic line that we consider that research is important, very important for society, and we have to maximize its use. One of these ways, indeed, is to put science results at the service of policymaking. We have with us the chair of our working group on the green and digital transitions, Mali Motiorg, and she will be the moderator of the session. We have 5 distinguished panelists, all with their experiences in science policy, on research careers, etc. And I am very happy to say that this event has been the very fruitful collaboration with the Marie Curie Alumni Association, and we have Mustafa Munir here with us representing them. I think that with any further ado, I would like to pass the word to Malin and allow her to chair this interesting session.
Thank you so much, Lydia, and welcome all of you to this hopefully very interactive session focusing on how to become an effective science policy advisor. As Lydia told you, my name is Malin Motiorg. I work at FORMAS, a senior policy officer at FORMAS, a Swedish Research Council for Sustainable Development, and also involved as a chair in Science Europe Digital Working Group and Working Group on Digital and Green Transition. Previously, I have been a researcher involved very much in the interface of academic research and policymaking on topics related to climate-related security risks. Today, we will focus on science advice, which is relevant in all kinds of topical areas and also increasingly relevant, facing important societal challenges: health, climate, green transition, digitalization, and so on. And we have 4 prominent speakers who will share their experience of science policy interactions and lessons learned from providing policy advice in different topical areas and policy context. And I think that is really a strong benefit of this session. So the aim is that you, after this session, you will have received food for thought, suggestions and recommendations on how to become a better and more efficient science policy advisor and be more confident and also be interested to do more in this space. Soon, I will describe how we will set this session up, how we will organize it. But first, I would like to introduce our speakers. First, we have Dr. Mustafa Shabrar, a former chair of Marie Curie Alumni Association, a worldwide organization with members from 140 plus countries. And Mustafa has great experience working in different academic environments in different countries and has been engaged in several policy initiatives. Our second speaker is Dr. Véronique Olain, a Secretary General of a Fund for Scientific Research, a large funding agency in the French-speaking parts of Belgium, supporting basic and strategic research in all scientific fields. She's also a professor and heading a chemical engineering research group. And the third speaker is Professor Zbigniew Kunczewicz at Poznan University of Life Sciences, corresponding member of the Polish Academy of Sciences, and member of Academia Europaea. And he's also affiliated to Potsdam Institute of Climate Impact and has been lead author in several publications at the IPCC. And the fourth speaker is, not the least, Dr. Mairead O'Driscoll, Chief Executive Officer of the Health Research Board of Ireland, where she oversees an annual investment of 45 million euro in health research activities. And she has had numerous roles in Health Research Board and has worked as a researcher in both academia and in industry. And I'm so pleased to have you four here with your vast experience in different areas. So, how will we set this session? We will work that each expert will present a one-line advice for science policy advisors based on their lessons. And you, as participants, will be voting on these. We will provide whether you strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree to these statements. Some of these may be phrased positively and some negatively. So be intuitive. Your responses will be anonymous. So just take your intuitive response. The voting system will be open maybe 30 seconds. And then after the voting, the aggregated responses will be provided and the experts will explain their advice in more in-depth, discussing the rationale, maybe provide examples in order to help you learn from these kind of experiences. So this will be repeated. So each expert will be able to provide different thoughts and lessons from their previous work. And then we will summarize and provide also space for a Q&A. So please, if you have questions, write those in the chat and we'll try to pick those up during the session. And finally, the final remarks will be provided by Nicola Francesco at Science Europe, but then also from Mustafa Shabrav in order for focusing specifically on younger researcher and research careers. With this, I look forward to start the session. I'm so pleased to have you here. And Nicola, please. Now we are ready for the first advice. So the advice, researchers should learn to understand the perspective and language of policymakers.
Thank you very much. It's really interesting to see the results. Almost everyone except very little percent strongly agree or agree. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious, isn't it? The goal of communication is to understand, and the ability to understand comes from the understanding the language and perspective of others. Yeah. So if you're a researcher and you are presenting your research results, nowadays, the first tip you get is to know your audience first. Similarly, in the science policy context, because it's a really extensive area, fostering collaboration between different stakeholders, including government and researchers. It basically bridges between two different fields and culture, science and policy. So the norm, what you are accustomed with in science, in scientific area or research field or research culture may not similarly in the science policy. So before getting engaged, the first and foremost for a researcher is to understand the basic process, the language of policymaker, what works, what doesn't work, and most importantly, the perspective. Now, how do you do that in reality? I mean, if you're a young researcher, there are different options for you. There are organizations like JRC, Marie Curie Alumni Association, Eurodoc, Science Europe, who can actually, or who are planning to organize events focusing on science policy. There are also conferences like Science Advice Under Pressure, which is basically the side event we are hosting today. So there are different opportunities to get involved and understand the policymakers' perspective. So I would end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And then I think we are ready to the second advice. And that says, a science policy advisor does not need to be a peer-recognized scientific expert. And here you will have, as previously, 5 different options to choose between.
I understand why I think it is balanced, because I think, in fact, it depends on the role you give to the science policy advisor. If he or she is clearly a missing link between scientific expertise and decision maker, if the role is clearly limited to explaining the process, to organizing an opinion strategy on various subjects, so not necessarily you not need to be a peer-recognized expert, even if better, because you are there not to provide the answers, but to ask the right questions. But in many non-Anglo-Saxon countries, such as France or Belgium, this function does not exist as such, and the politician questions the scientific expert directly. And in this case, yes, he or she must be recognized by peers. And let me illustrate this with a concrete example recently experienced in Belgium. In the context of the COVID crisis and the debates on vaccination, the Health Committee of the Chamber of Representatives at the Federal Parliament auditioned a specialist in virology at the request of one of the political parties. And the guy presented himself as a doctor of science, a specialist in virology with professional experience in the development of vaccines. And a couple of days after, more than 50 renowned Belgian researchers wrote and signed a carte blanche in one of Belgium's most visible newspapers. And the concern stemmed from the fact that this person, who had presented himself as an expert, was not a peer-reviewed scientific expert. His curriculum vitae did not indicate any significant or accessible academic, biotechnological, or pharmaceutical scientific contribution in the field of human medicine, vaccines, immunology, virology, or public health. And this was evidenced by the almost total absence of recent publications over the last 5 years, as listed in PubMed. So the researchers concluded that these parameters were sufficient to invalidate his status as an expert, and that the status of scientific expert cannot be acquired by simple self-proclamation, especially if this status justifies the submission of an opinion to the highest legislative body of a democratic state. Of course, a parliament can hear opinions based on reasoning other than science, but parliamentarians cannot be fooled when these opinions are dishonestly presented as scientific expertise. So finally, those researchers gave some advice. They recommended it should be publicly clarified in what capacity any person heard gives an opinion or advice. And if this capacity is that of a scientific expert, they propose that the expert status be systematically validated by at least 2 scientific bodies, such as the Academy of Science or the Academy of Medicine or the Research Funding Agency. This was my advice.
Thank you so much. May I just a quick follow-up here, if you would like to provide also in terms, this story is very challenging and provide so many different things, but is it also how, in what way scientists also provides their methods? How would you like to also say the level of details? Is it something here you would like to emphasize on?
Sorry, because I was reading, you were speaking to me.
Yes.
Okay, because yeah. I was looking at the chat and someone wrote that it is shocking. And so yeah. I wonder what is shocking. I was wondering, but can you tell me again?
Yeah, no, I was thinking here on the general level, and when you communicate the method as a researcher, do you have any suggestion on the level of details here? How researchers provide their methods? Is there something general you would like, generic you would like to provide here?
I think it's very important that you communicate on the methods, because in the context of the pandemic in Belgium, people were shocked by contradictory advices from the scientists, and they were also, they have the impression that science is a fixed set of authoritative information. But this is not true. Science is on the edge of error. Researchers work at the frontier of knowledge. And so it's very important to communicate to the audience what is the scientific methodology, and also to communicate on the figures very clearly. I think it's crucial.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Then we will be ready to take the third advice. And that says researchers should deliver policy relevant rather than policy prescriptive advice. And here, Zbigniew will be able to respond and reflect on the question, on your responses.
My experience is based on a long career within IPCC. That stands for Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I have been involved with IPCC for more than 25 years. And for IPCC, which is a clearly policy relevant body, there is a kind of a rule of the game, or a mantra, or an IPCC culture telling us that we cannot tell countries what they should do, right? So we provide policy relevant advice, but do not tell countries what to do. We avoid policy prescriptive language in our reports. We do not say, we do not write shall, should, have to, must not. We are careful with our wording. Maybe IPCC is too careful because the consensus building process is sometimes quite long-lasting. So IPCC converges slowly, trying to achieve consensus. But there is a tradition, and I think quite a lot of achievement, because IPCC is following this policy relevant but not policy prescriptive mantra very rigorously for actually 32 years. So this is the length of IPCC career from the first assessment report. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think if you have an immediate here additional thought, I think this might be something for all of you to also think through if you can help also maybe providing pieces of specific advice, how you can formulate those, how they are set up in your experience. So if you have something immediate here, Zbigniew, please do, and then otherwise think through also, that has been something picked up in the chat here. So that is something for you to pay attention to. But I think you phrased, you provided some phrasing here. Okay, should we go forward to the fourth advice? This says science policy advice is the same as science communication. And here we have Merit soon, who will be reflecting on the responses.
Thanks very much indeed, Malin. I think this is very interesting to see the responses. So most people strongly disagreeing with this. I think I would probably be in the same camp as a lot of people on this subject. So the whole point, I suppose, about communication, I mean, we know that research is quite complicated. Research findings tend to be quite technical. So research always needs to be translated. Particularly now it's increasingly specialized. You know, if you try and read a research paper, I mean, it is quite complicated if you're not in the field, and most of us aren't, you know, in a particular field. So research always needs to be translated for the audience. And that's generally true whether you're talking to a general audience or whether you're talking to politicians or policymakers. You have to sort of try and translate it and speak the language. But of course, then how you do that and how you frame that depends entirely on the audience. So for the general public, very often when we talk about science communication, we're talking about a general audience. So you might be talking, you know, you might be on social media, you might be on a TV or in radio or whatever. So it tends to be sort of lighter, of course, always factual, but nevertheless presented in a lighter way, maybe more accessible, more relatable. It might even need to be entertaining because, of course, science journalism has to compete with other stories as well. But of course, for policymakers, it's a different story because they're interested in the evidence and the research to inform a particular policy. So you're framing it in the context, the way you sort of set out and explain things is going to be different. You're focused maybe a little bit more technical, albeit in a way that is accessible for policymakers and politicians, but it is very, very different because they are, of course, trying to frame maybe or develop a particular policy issue, or you're maybe trying to address a particular policy problem. So, for example, we had a discussion here, I'm sure as you all did in your countries in Ireland during the COVID crisis around mask wearing. And of course, there would be lots of, communication about that and in sort of general media about whether or not you need to wear masks or whether people liked wearing masks or behavioural signs and things like that. But when the policymakers come to actually set, they need hard evidence and hard data. And so it's a different audience and you're presenting your data in a different way. So I suppose the point here is good communication is always very important, but you do need to think about your audience and adapt the way you present your data. Malin, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you so much. And now I hope everyone has learned how this section is organized. So we have now covered the first 4 advice, and I think we are ready now to maybe speed up a little bit so we also could have this Q&A time for picking up some of the highly interesting questions in the chat as well. So we take the 5th questions, and that will be Mustafa, who soon will be reflecting on this advice, which says, science is and should be the only source for policymakers. Please make your voting, and Mustafa is ready to soon reflect on your responses.
So I see that about close to more than 75% is basically disagree and strongly agree. So this is a good number. If you rephrase the statement a bit, policy is never only based on evidence alone. I mean, science is about the truth, and where policy is about agreement. So effective policy can only come from agreeing what the truth is. And our debate begins and ends there. That is why actually researchers commit their lives searching for evidence. However, in policy, the decision makers and stakeholders may not find evidence to be the most important driving factors, as policy development often leads to a societal agreement and social desire. I mean, it was really very nicely explained by Maria regarding the mask and what to wear, what not to wear. And that actually tells us that when policymakers make decisions, there are other crucial factors which are involved. For example, economic issues, geopolitical situation, what the wider society wants. So as a researcher, you need to understand this process and accept that even a sound advice may not be implemented due to other barriers. But you should not get frustrated. It's a process and you need to keep your engagement. In such cases, generally policymakers need to see the benefit. So showing them the long-term benefit for your scientific evidence may make sense. You also need to understand who has the power and context to change it. I mean, just to give you a practical example, we all know what happened during the Horizon Europe initial budget cut. I mean, we were going to the research ministers, different stakeholders, almost everyone agreed and understood that more budget is necessary, but there was the economic barrier behind that. So you also need to understand who to approach. It's not in that particular case, it's not only the research ministers, but also the finance ministers who should be approached. So remember that we are talking about now policy opinion. So remember that the opinion can be influenced by evidence. And we as a researcher, our effort should basically to influence the people's opinion through evidence. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We continue with the next advice, which says researchers should be ready to discuss with contradictory experts. And it is Veronique who soon will be reflecting on your responses.
Yes, I'm not surprised by the result. Of course, scientists are obviously used to discussion, to the confrontation of views, argumentation. It's really an intrinsic part of the scientific method. It's also part of the exchanges in seminars and scientific congresses. So this is a process that can be carried out in a respectful way in such a context. But the situation can be very different when it comes to giving advice to government and or communicating in the media. And in the context of the COVID crisis in Belgium, a multidisciplinary group of experts was set up to advise the government on the measures to be taken. And of course, some of these experts were invited to communicate to the public. And they were widely invited by the media, in fact, and they were confronted with many contradictory opinions in this context. And arguing against other experts in the context of a TV program, for example, is very different from arguing in the context of a technical group. You cannot use two technical arguments that could not be understood by the public, and at the same time must try to use pedagogy to justify a scientific opinion. So it was really difficult in Belgium for the audience to understand that experts do not agree with each other. As mentioned by the other panelists, experts were contradicting each other on the measures to be taken, a mask or no mask, strict lockdown or not, social bubbles limited to the same 5 people or no social bubbles. So people often have the impression, I told it before, that science is really a fixed set of authoritative information, but this is not the case, and scientists live with uncertainties. And I think that is why we must be very careful about communication and communicates the uncertainties of the contestation. So I think the difficulties obviously arise when science interacts with issues that are of enormous political and social interest, which is what happened with the pandemic. And perhaps I think we have not taken enough opportunity during that crisis to explain this in the context of that crisis. And I think this is really the right time now to try to make people understand that in the process of acquiring new knowledge, uncertainties and controversies must be accepted.
Thank you so much. And I have understood that there is a lot of interesting thoughts which also comes up in the chat, and we will get help a little bit later on to be able to pick up some of those. So we continue with the next suggested advice, number 7, which says researchers should let their research being used by decision makers. And once we have a result, Spignard will provide his reflections on this.
So actually, perhaps the immediate reaction to this question would be yes, but. So conditional. One can find caveats. Actually, published results are in public domain. So whether researchers let or don't let their published results being used by decision makers, it doesn't matter. Decision makers may help themselves to publish results. There is a different story with ongoing work and unpublished results. Well, the condition that I'd like to express is that there is a risk of being manipulated, of being instrumentalized. Citing Paul Simon, one hears what he wants to hear and disregards the rest. So this is serious. This is potentially serious. That the advice can be abused. And in any case, whether it's a question of a published work or unpublished, there is a need for interpretation. So there is a role for a scientist to interpret, to act as an intermediary between the science and policy. Example from IPCC. Sometimes IPCC full reports are very technical and full of details. For instance, there are figures with a caption that is nearly a page long. Decision makers don't like it. That's why they have a technical summary and summary for policymakers. Every IPCC report is accompanied by simpler versions of information, letting decision makers get a more comprehensible, better understandable imagery. I stop here. Thanks.
Thank you so much. May I actually, since you said this, how to avoid that the advice is being abused, would you like to provide a reflection on how you are able to do that? Could you give some thoughts here on how can scientists or researchers trying to avoid this in the interaction?
I'm afraid there is no silver bullet here.
No.
I think we should be aware that our advice sometimes is not treated in a way we would like to. But I don't see a tool how to avoid. Being aware, this is already something.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And then we turn to next advice, number 8, which says science policy advice can be given regardless of policy target. And here Merit soon will reflect on your responses.
Thank you, Malin. It's a mixed bag, but I'm not surprised in a way because it's actually quite an ambiguous sort of a question, I guess. So what does it really mean? And I think what it means is, and it's been touched on maybe by other speakers already, which is about context and about thinking about the context and also thinking about the place in the policy cycle. So what do we mean by policy advice and what is the purpose of that advice? And, you know, to be a little practical about it, are you hoping that your research and the information, the good data and evidence you have, are you trying to influence a new policy? Are you trying to amend or change an existing policy or review it? Are you looking at how a policy gets implemented? So, for example, you know, a couple of examples from the health field, you know, we have put fluorides in our water here supply in Ireland for many decades to improve people's dental health. Sometimes that's controversial, people get annoyed about it. But, you know, we have a lot of, it's been there for a long time and it's an existing policy. So from time to time that is reviewed and people look at that and they look at the data and the evidence and has that actually changed? But a new idea that came up, I'm sure you have it also maybe in some of your countries, is around the idea of a sugar tax. You know, this idea because of obesity and everything, should we be introducing a sugar tax? That has not been introduced before. So that's a brand new policy. So again, you're looking at different sorts of advice, different sorts of evidence maybe and data. So I suppose the point here is to look at the context. Your research may be relevant in different contexts and it may fit in at different points in the policy cycle. And so it's worth thinking about that in the context of your policy advice and thinking about the target for that advice. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. We continue to the 9th question. I think we are halfway through and the timing is a little bit, so maybe we can be a little bit quicker if it also would be possible to be even more intuitive in your responses so we can close the voting quicker. Advice 9. Only senior researchers can provide science policy advice as early career researchers do not have enough expertise. And here, Mustafa will soon reflect on your responses.
So there are about 6% who strongly agree, and mostly people are disagreeing and strongly disagree. So that looks actually good number, what I hope for. Well, I mean, it might be complicated for you because in one way we are saying that as a early career researcher, you first need to understand and get involved to the policy. On the other hand, we are saying that also early career researchers needs to get involved, basically provide advice or get active. Why is that? Remember, expertise may not be always directly related with the career stage. Human intelligence is always multifaceted. What needs to be focused is the advice is robust and impact is desirable. we need to focus on the merit of the advice. And also remember, early career researcher can bring a completely different perspective with their fresh new look and can provide and propose innovative solutions. So basically, we need to ensure that there is a balance and harmony of all different perspectives. I would stop here due to the time.
Thank you so much. And we move forward. And now we will challenge you to close the polls a little bit quicker. So we challenge you, advice 10, researchers should stick to their fields of expertise and do not provide advice on other areas. The polls is open, and Veronique will soon, when we have the results, reflect on that.
Well, I think the question may of course be especially relevant in the context of communication in the press or in social networks. At the FNRS, for instance, we employ some 1,800 researchers. Some of them are more charismatic than others, and they are very active on social networks and are much sought after by the media. And in this context, they are encouraged to express themselves on subjects outside their field of competence. Of course, they are free to express a personal opinion, but the general public can be misled into believing that the message comes from a scientific expert in this particular area. But this question is not only relevant in the context of communication in the press or in social networks. Of course, as an expert, you can be appointed for your scientific skills as a member of an experts group set up for government. And effective advice increasingly relies on interdisciplinary expertise. And in Belgium, for example, a parliamentary commission was recently set up on decolonization with the stated aim of examining the Belgian colonial past in Congo, in Rwanda, in Burundi. It's a very hot topic in Belgium. And so they've chosen a multidisciplinary and multicultural team. This is probably justified. And among the experts finally chosen are historians specializing in colonial history, an African historian, a specialist in contemporary history, an art historian, an activist again at Afrophobia, a researcher in political science, a doctor of philosophy and international relations, specialist in reconciliation process, a lawyer, an historian specializing in Africa and colonial culture. And so the commission has barely been set up and already seems to be in troubled waters, according to some. And in such condition, I think the serenity of the work is far from assured. And in such a context, one can imagine that it will be very difficult for the members of the commission to confine themselves strictly to the field of expertise. And yet, this is essential in terms of credibility. And so generally speaking, I think that our democracies are threatened by opinions that take precedence over knowledge. And when a scientist, an expert in one field, gives an opinion on other subjects in which he or she has no particular expertise other than an opinion, taking advantage of his or her scientific position, this becomes dangerous.
Thank you, Veronique. And we continue with the next advice. Rectification of fake news and misconception is an important duty of scientists. And here Zbigniew soon will reflect on the responses.
Right, so there are 82% of responders who either agree or strongly agree. This is what I expected. So indeed, I think we agree that rectification of fake news and misconceptions is very important, but they are important technical questions, how to proceed. What is a platform? Where? Probably social media. When? The fake news are given in real time. So actually the rectification should come very fast. Maybe I give an example from one country where a deputy minister of the government issued the statement that the country is coping with COVID quite well at the level of EU average. and the COVID statistics are at the EU average. It was issued in November 2020, and in fact, the statement was quite imprecise, quite fuzzy. It didn't give reference date, and there are many possible indices that could be considered. But the truth was that the country in question was doing very bad on COVID deaths and excess deaths. It was actually not the EU average, but the worst country in the EU. And actually scientists reacted, but science reacts not so fast. So the reaction was in a form of a scientific peer-reviewed paper. Good for a career of scientists, maybe not necessarily good for immediate rectification of fake news. I stop here, thanks.
Thank you so much. We continue with the 12th advice. Researchers should consider carefully the policy question and then think about the scientific advice to inform an answer. And while you both in Merit will prepare to provide reflections on the responses.
Thank you, Alan, and most people strongly agree with this statement, I think. And just very briefly, we all know the importance of a good research question. I think everybody who works in research knows that, but also you need a good policy question. So when it comes to policy, you have to take the time to work with a policymaker to frame the question, because very often policymakers have a general idea about what they want. They might ask a question in a very general way that's not easily answered. So you have to take the time to pin it down, to discuss exactly what it is they're looking for and what it is they need to know. So I'll stop there, Mala, to be brief.
Thank you so much. And that we will pick up that with this kind of interaction. We move forward and we are very good in the time, I think. So now we will enter the last 4 of these pieces of advice, and then we will have this Q&A and be able to pick up a lot of the questions in the chat. So the next advice, get involved in science policy advice early in your research career. And here Mustafa soon will be able to reflect on the responses.
Okay, so about more than half of them are actually agreeing. So this is what I was hoping. First, understand that not everyone's research work will be related with science policy. So there are 2 ways you can contribute to science policy. While you are a scientist, giving your scientific advice to corresponding stakeholders. So that's one way. If you look at the United States, there is like Jefferson Chair or similar example where a professor is spending time on science policy or providing advice. Second is transitioning from scientist position into a policy advisor position. I believe that's what is our event about a bit more. In both cases, it is really crucial to start early, start at the local level, sharpen your skill, communication skill, how to formulate message for different audience, understand who are your actors or stakeholders on specific area, and get involved with different organization and build a network. I would stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now the next advice, which says researchers can act as a science policy advisor and activist at the same time. And here Veronique soon will reflect on the responses.
I think, well, it's possible to a certain extent. But at some point, you probably must make a choice and keep things in perspective. Because, well, the better use of science in government is based on a high level of trust. And this trust can only be gained and maintained if the advisor or the expert acts as a knowledge broker, but never as a lobbyist. And so I think the problem is also the one of scientific neutrality and honesty. How to ensure that your advice is not influenced by your political or philosophical commitment. And it's also the question of potential conflict of interest, the question of the credibility of your scientific advice, which could be perceived as being overly influenced by an overly passionate engagement. So I think in that case, as I mentioned before, it's really particularly important to communicate well the methodology of the science research that leads to the advice, to communicate the broader methodological principles and concepts that underpin scientific evidence. I think, well, however, as far as possible, it's useful to keep the two roles distinct, I think, in order to avoid being perceived as a lobbyist. I will stop here.
Thank you so much. And we continue, so we have a two last advice. Scientists should communicate uncertainty to decision makers rather than ignore it. Calibrated uncertainty language used in the IPCC lends itself well to applications.
Right, so 94% of responders agree, or even strongly agree. Actually, one of the participants made an interesting remark on the chat, that science is about doubt. I like it. Perhaps not everyone knows what calibrated uncertainty language of IPCC is. In IPCC reports, we never say will about forecast for the future. We say are projected to increase, for instance, rather than will increase. And we give subjective probability, which is as scientific as possible. We say virtually certain when it is 99% or more subjective probability. Very likely, well, first of all, extremely likely, 95, very likely 90, likely 66%, more likely than not 50 plus. And so on, up to extremely unlikely, which is 5%, and virtually uncertain, 1%. But there is quite often the situation of deep uncertainty when we cannot provide uncertainty estimate. This is when we deal with unknown unknowns. So surprised that we have not considered. I like a Chinese proverb, Chinese saying, knowing ignorance is strength. Ignoring knowledge is sickness. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we will now take the last advice, and then we will have some time for a Q&A and pick up some of the questions in the chat. So please, this last advice, researchers should provide scientific advice regardless of the stage of the policy cycle. And here we have Mered, who soon will reflect on the voting.
Thank you. So I can see most people agree with this or strongly agree or are neutral about it, and a small number disagree. I think the point about this really is to understand that there is a policy cycle, and a policy cycle has different stages. If you think about it, you know, it's about setting an agenda, who decides what's important in the first place and what question is important. It's about then looking at alternatives. If you think that a policy is needed in a particular area, looking at different alternatives, designing a policy or an intervention or a public policy intervention, then how do you implement it? And then when you've implemented it, how do you evaluate it? And then the cycle starts again. So most people will think about it. If you think about it, you can see that is the case. So I think it's important to think about then where advice sits in that policy cycle. But I suppose the most important thing is to understand that there is a policy cycle, and then to think about how you can interact and the different points where you can have a meaningful interaction. I'll stop there, Mala.
Thank you so much. And now we have went through these, and I think I have not been able to follow the chat in details, but I have understood that there is plenty of activities. And I think that is also part here, that these are not simple answers. These are, we could elaborate so much deeper on so many of these advices that has been provided, and also intentionally being maybe a little bit more provocative sometimes. So I think I will start to pick up, and then I know that I will receive some help from Nicola to pick up questions. But one question I saw in the chat I would like to hear some of you reflect upon is, who is an expert? How should we think about expertise? And because sometimes the boundaries has been said that you should only communicate where you are an expert. But what is an expert? And how and who decides who is an expert? So please, I don't know who would like, Veronique, maybe if you would like, or someone else. Please go ahead.
Yes, indeed. In the first question that I proposed, I addressed that issue in the context of that mini crisis in Belgium, where there was a self-proclaimed expert, and so there was a debate coming from the scientific community suggesting that an expert should be recognized by his peer, but it's difficult. What are the peers? So they proposed that an expert should be validated by a scientific body, an academy or funding agency. But well, at least, but the peers recognize an expert because they are part of the same community. But the problem is that if you constitute a group of experts to advise a government, how do you choose them? And so maybe it's a good idea to ask the advice of an academy or funding agency to recommend the experts, and based on the expertise of the knowledge and the curriculum vitae of the people and so on.
Thank you. Someone else who would like to provide, and maybe also pay attention here to different kinds of top scientific areas where they also don't have not necessarily strict boundaries on how to evaluate, calculate, or make this decision. Please, Setmir.
The expert should be trustworthy based on earlier experience. Of course, I recently reviewed some careers, and one gentleman had a Hirsch factor of 120, which is extremely high, very high. This means that he has persuaded the editors of leading journals to publish his papers many times. Very good journals. Probably this is not fair enough for policy. In policy, again, I give an IPCC example. IPCC is a quality mark because every piece of assessment report has been co-authored by hundreds of people and reviewed by thousands. So there are many thousands review comments. And actually reacting to reviews is more difficult and more time consuming than writing. So this is a really deep peer review in IPCC. I think we can call these people experts, and this is how they are called in IPCC process, but it's a collective experts, not one, it's a mass of experts. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm sorry. Thank you so much. And another question which maybe relates to this is that you can be considered as a very profound expert in an area in terms of publications and scientific records, but then there are the skills, because you also talked about this with the science. It is to provide the advice, but it's also this relationship with the communication. And then there is another forms of skills which comes into. And how, in your experience, how do you think about how to train, how to practice those kind of skills in order to, you provide the method, you provide how you approach the research in terms of the scientific approach, but at the same time, the skills to communicate those so they become tangible, understandable in the policy context. Is anyone Interested, challenged, intrigued? Please, Merit, to reflect on this.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one because I was looking in the chat and people are saying, well, you know, you kind of have this idea that there are researchers and then there are policymakers, and the researchers are working away and then there's policymakers over here. But of course, really increasingly, what you need are people who are able to do the synthesis, who are able to do the evidence synthesis, who are able to interpret the information, who are able to collate it, or people who are able to broker that relationship between the two. And so that's a whole skill set in its own right. You know, a lot of people who do work in that space will have originally been, you know, they will come from an academic background, but they have moved more and more as they move towards policy work. They've moved more into the kind of evidence synthesis where they're pulling in and looking at papers and meta-analysis and things like that. So I think it's never too early in any case to learn those skills. And very often now we're a funding agency, and when we ask people to apply to us for a grant, we will ask them, well, what else has been done in this field? Has this work been done before? How does it fit in? Is there a systematic review or anything of this piece of work if people are looking at an intervention? So I think developing skills around evidence synthesis is a very, very useful tool for researchers, even if they, you know, stay within within their own discipline in an academic setting. But certainly if you have any aspirations or intentions or interest in working in policy related areas, I think that whole area of evidence synthesis, and there are many good, you know, courses and training programs that are available in that area. And I think it's well worthwhile looking at some of those.
Thank you. And Mustafa, please.
Yes, I fully agree with Merit. Also, just want to add another perspective. Even if you're not involved in science policy, it's really advisable that if your research, you really understand and try to communicate your research, because it might be that some other policymaker will actually take your research result and research outcome and use in the policy context. So I remember with my interview with the IIIS CEO, who basically said that we don't need one Carl Sagan. We need thousands of scientists who are ready to communicate their results, provide the science, basically use the science communication at the local level. So then the first skill would be science communication. I see that this question is actually related with another question, if you allow me, if I can
please.
take that.
Yes, please.
Is Naya, if I'm pronouncing her name right, it's Naya Nagaur. Can you please provide concrete examples of how to transition from academia to policy? What are the specific things young researchers can do and pursue in active scientific career a prerequisite for a career in science policy? I will start with the first. There are really a lot of examples because the Marie Curie alumni at Marie Curie Alumni Association, we have researchers who basically transition into science policy. I could name actually two without mentioning the name and share their details. What they did is they get the training, what Mary basically said at the beginning. They get involved with local network. They started to basically contribute in MCA policy working group, understand, basically interact with policymaker, and then start applying their job. One of them basically is right now the unit head of the Royal Society of Chemistry. Another one is working at the CSER. I think Lydia and some of you know very well. We have also other members who are, I mean, if I look at the science policy arena, this is basically all our members who actually have a good transition. That was the way they first get training, and then there are different activities. One, I would basically mention it at the end bit briefly, and then started to show that, you know, because you are a scientist, you need to get some experience on policy arena. So join a group where you can write statement, where you can engage with policymaker or different stakeholder, and then start applying for job. Your last question, whether it's a prerequisite or not, I would say, in my opinion, it's not, because I have seen that, well, it depends what is your definition of scientific career. Yeah, I have seen that people who are active in public policy also collaborate a lot with scientists. So if you are coming from public policy, that should be enough. Yeah, that's my intake. I'm sure the speakers will have other intake. Thank you.
Is anyone interested to reflect a little bit on this one? Otherwise, I will pose maybe the last question for maybe all of you, or some you can. I take this a question I picked up, and I think this in the policy space, as you have been discussed, there are different forms of expertise which becomes relevant. There are different scientific areas, and most policy decisions include so many different characters. You need to deal with so many different aspects in your policy making. So how, when you are a scientific expertise, maybe more disciplinary based scientific expertise, you are in the setting which is much broader, which pays attention to not only then different forms, your own expertise, but also different experts from different scientific areas, and also other forms of experts. So how does it work? Is it something here you can see how you try to navigate in terms of being in that quite broader context, dealing with different forms of expertise, research areas, but then also other forms of expertise? Is there something here you can bring to the others in terms of how to navigate in that kind of context from your experiences? No one? How has it challenged you? Have you started to learn, trying to understand the different forms of scientific methods, perspectives, ways of interpreted science results, and also how to communicate? Is it there here anything from your previous experience where you think I need to challenge myself, learn more from other perspectives, which informs your own work?
Malin, I'm not sure if I've understood that, so maybe the question exactly, but are you talking about how to bring in other disciplines or the extra?
Yeah, how you engage and interact and develop also in terms of providing, being in that space, a broader space.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that, I mean, it's a bit of a cliche, but I mean, the whole area of working in interdisciplinary research and actually sort of trying to look at the broader context for your research and trying to forge partnerships, alliances, even joint research projects, like we're always very interested as a funding agency in things that come in that bring in, that aren't just very sort of homogenous, where you have a team that does bring in different perspectives. And I think looking for opportunities like that, where you can work bring your particular expertise, but working in a multidisciplinary team is actually very, very good, because just by working with other people and by hearing their perspectives and hearing that expertise, it tends to spark off ideas. I think it sort of expands everybody's horizons a little bit. I'm not sure if that's answering your question, but I think it's quite practical actually, just to get involved with working with people in other disciplines.
Thank you. And Veronique?
Maybe I can add some comments in my capacity of leading a research funding agency. Two things, I think. First, regarding the interdisciplinarity, it's very difficult to assess. So we try to organize a scientific commission with experts in their disciplines. And well, this is an issue. How do you really evaluate, assess, because the different experts have really different fields, different traditions. So this is complex, and the interdisciplinary projects, disciplinary experts may find that the part of the project they understand is not at the top if it was a disciplinary project. This is one issue, but the other issue is that we have large commissions, scientific commission, for instance, in physics and mathematics. Is the projects proposals evaluate by one single commission, and a physicist working at CERN will publish 500 publications a year with 1,000 of co-writers, and a mathematician will publish every 3 years. I exaggerate, of course, but we'll publish every 3 years one single paper, being the single author. And really, what I can see, there is a lot of respect from both communities. They understand that they have their own rules and they respect the rules of the other communities. And this is not an issue when discussing proposals and selecting proposals for funding.
Thank you. And Signiv here as well.
Thank you. Actually, in Poland, during the COVID crisis, there was a group of advisors to a chairperson, president of the Polish Academy of Sciences. And there were three groups of disciplines represented: health science, economy, and society, social scientists. It is very important to be able to state what the society will do, how it will react. And maybe one more comment based on my experience. In the year 2001, I was given a task, a hopeless task, to be a coordinating lead author of a European chapter of the IPCC report on climate change impact, adaptation, and vulnerability. So I had to cover all sectors in Europe. It was a good lesson. So being humble is one thing that I would recommend, and learning to listen to people and stick to the field of expertise. This comment was made today. So I didn't pretend I'm an expert on every field, but I had somehow to weight the relative weight of different statements. So at the end, it was a good lesson. Thanks.
Thank you. And I think this being humble and that you continuously continue to learn throughout your career, from you are in the early stage until you are a full professor and as long as you live, I think that is a nice way of ending this part of the discussion at this session. And I will now provide first some few reflections that Nicola Francesco Dotti at Science Europe has picked up. And then I will hand over to Mustafa, which I think will provide some additional maybe thoughts to young career researchers. So please, Nicola, you first.
Thank you, Malin, and thank to all the speakers for sharing their experience with us. I think it was very rich discussion. I was also very interested and intrigued by all the comments we received from the chat and also in the Q&A. I'm a bit sorry because we won't be able to reply to all of them, but I think that the topic is of high interest, is very relevant, and the climate crisis, the COVID crisis, and also now also all the implication with the crisis in Ukraine are putting high attention on the science advice mechanisms that are in place. So that's good to be part of it. I would have a lot of messages and to take home, but I try to summarize some of them. One is the importance, the willingness that I think it's clear to everybody that science is not anymore in the ivory tower. The idea of science to be closed in a lab doesn't exist anymore, and there is more and more engagement. And I think that the discussion today was very good to bring the complexity, the challenges, also the difficulties, and some of the contradictions that maybe might exist. We are dealing with something which is not easy. It's challenging. So this is good, and the discussion was very rich for what we could do in a very short time. Our first message is I really like when the speakers say that science is about truth and doubt, while policy is about action, what to do, what should governments do, how should we address, what to do with the COVID crisis, for instance. And yes, I take a message also from yesterday is that it's interesting to highlight the differences between the COVID and the climate change crisis, because with COVID, basically we knew nothing and we did a lot, really a lot. On climate change, we can say we know everything, okay, not everything, but really a lot, and we are doing very little in comparison to what we know. So this is interesting to reflect on this distinction that I simplify in just 2 lines, but I think it's good to keep in mind the interaction and the reflection on this complexity. I also liked one of the comments in the chat, if I'm not mistaken, that scientists is also used to live with uncertainties, to deal with these uncertainties, and this brings to the second message: how to communicate this uncertainty when you give a science-based policy advice. Uncertainty is part of life, and the case of COVID made it very evident that we didn't know what to do at the beginning. COVID-19, because we discovered it in 2019. So that's we tend to forget the number. And on this, I'm particularly grateful to Medo Driscoll and Veronica Luan for their contribution on their role on how to clarify the role of science advisor. And I see that many comments to make clear what is the role, what is the expectation, what are the expertise, the skills, and how they should be involved in the various stages of the policy cycles. These are very interesting to learn. In the first question, Mustafa highlighted the importance of learning how to the language of policymakers, which is different from science, and we should be aware of this difference, which is important and is good. Now, a very final point that I take from the question asked by Professor Kunjevic on policy relevant versus policy prescriptive, that was framed during this conference, the distinction between science advice, science-based advice, and policy advice. It's legitimate also to be as a citizen to say that you disagree with some decision of the governments. That's part of the debate, and this is good. And the key word is really trust, respect, listening, and understanding the role of science, of policy, and all the policy knowledge brokers that exist, because this field is getting more and more interesting and relevant. I stop here and I did my best to summarize a very complex and extremely rich conversation, for which I thank the speakers and all the comments on the chat I see keeps on coming.
Thank you so much, Nicola. And please, Mustafa, your final.
Yeah, it's a really challenging task to summarize such an insightful session. I fully agree with Nicola. Just one additional remark. Just to disagree a bit, we do actually know about the SARS and COVID, the virus itself, because, you know, there are a lot of funding organizations, some are member of Science Europe, including ERC, who provided funding early enough to deal with the similar type of virus. So that's the reason why we have the vaccination with the limited amount of time. But that also proves that why researchers, I mean, it's a broken record, I don't want to repeat it, but why research should be more funded. Fundamental research. But now in this session, I mean, if you're an early career researcher, you probably already know that we talked about that if you would like to get involved in the policy, first get necessary training, understand the language, understand the perspective, get involved with community and network. That's really important. I mean, because you would need to understand and talk with the different stakeholders. Once you have the training, the second point would be to basically, as Nicola and all our speakers says, the focus on the message, communication method, deliver the policy relevant contribution, and understand that different people might actually take your advice differently. So you would need to kind of an counter agreement. And also you need to think about the aim of advice, making the distinction between development of a new policy and existing policy. So my 3 suggestions: if you're an early career researcher, learn, get involved. If you're a mid-career researcher, assist. And if you're a really senior researcher, see the effect what you made already through science and policy, and how over the year, your own perspective even has changed. Before going, I would like to give a food for thought for all of us especially the funding organizations, as well as the different organizations. You know that in the United States, there is a very nice structure which basically AAAS does that. They train the early career researcher and then they place it in different government institutions. In Europe, there is the Blue Book training, but that's not really for a PhD researcher. That's for, I would say, a bit really students or at that level. So would it be possible that funding organization actually think something like that? The researchers are placed into the institutions, science policy institutions. I had this discussion with the JFC, and I'm really glad to tell you that there is this event, which is just, I posted on the chat, where MSCA is basically planning to do something like that. So there is a matchmaking event between the host institution and researcher who would like to involve in science policy. So I invite you to join this. So that's it from my side. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we are 2 minutes on overtime, but so I will provide my sincere thanks for a very interesting conversation, and I will have a lot of things I would like to reflect on, but I'm very appreciative of all your comments and sharing your experience. But I will hand over to Lydia for final remarks before closing this sessions. But
thank you very much.
On my side, thank you.
Yes, just very shortly, because we are over time. Thank you very much to all of you, the participants, the panelists. I think you have done a great job. You have all, the panelists have worked quite intensely to prepare this very well structured series of questions and challenging statements for you to think about. I think that the comments and questions in the chat are incredibly valuable, and we will take them all into account. I think that we will continue this work, and I hope that Marie Curie Alumni Association agrees that we could continue the partnership, because I think this could be just the first of several workshops and activities that we do in this respect. In Science Europe, we are, as you can see, increasingly promoting the role of research in science advice, and we will continue to do so by fostering integration into the concept of the research projects from the start, and not just as an add-on when it comes at the end of the project. And the other similar initiatives that we will, of course, discuss with Science Europe members, and hopefully we'll continue discussing with you. We will integrate all these comments into our activities, and we hope to see you again soon on a similar occasion. So thank you very much to all.